All right, so the topic is total maximum daily loads and the influence of municipal storm drain effluent on our local surface waters. Again, our special speaker is Molly Rippke from EGLE. She is from the Water Resources Division and is an aquatic biologist and works on various water quality projects throughout the state. And so she's going to give us some useful information on what should and should not be entering our waterways through stormwater infrastructure and at what limit. So monitoring tells us the what, where, and when of environmental issues. And without water quality monitoring, we wouldn't know what pollutants are in our water bodies, what fish you can eat, if you can or cannot eat the fish, and what beaches are safe for swimming, etc. So you guys, like we mentioned, we've been sampling 4 sites on Bear Lake, effluent sites that are directly connected to the surface water. And so at this time, we will turn it over to our special speaker, Molly.
Hello, everybody. I am going to try to share my screen.
Great.
I'm getting kind of a weird, oh, it says host disabled participation or participant screen sharing.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I don't know if you need to just like give me control, or I'm not sure how that works. I'm not familiar with Zoom really, so.
Does it let you now?
Let me try. Yes, yes it does.
Good.
All right. Yeah, I'm getting kind of a weird echo. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, the echo will distract me for a little while. Usually I feel like it kind of stops eventually. It just takes a minute to catch up.
Molly, the echo might be from, there's a few people that are not muted. And so I wonder if folks maybe need to mute if they're not speaking, and that might help with your echo.
Okay, yeah, that's probably a good plan. I do have a lot of stuff to cover today. So I had trouble with the title here. So I was like, wow, all these 3 things, water quality standards, designated uses, and TMDLs are so tied together. And the echo went away for a minute, but now it's back. I feel like maybe Richard needs to mute. Okay, so all these 3 things are tied together, and then I wanted to tie in stormwater too. So I've got a lot of stuff here. I hope we can cover some of it. But first of all, by way of introduction, I work for the Water Resources Division, and our primary responsibility is implementing the Federal Clean Water Act in many different ways. And we also implement our Michigan Clean Water Regulation, which is the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act, or NREPA. But I'm in the surface water assessment section. So I'm so glad that you put water quality monitoring in the description there, because that's what I do. And that's where all of this starts. One of the things I always say is you cannot fix a problem unless you know that there is a problem. And a lot of times we just go around oblivious to some of these problems because you can't see these pollutants until you see the after effects, which might be illness or excessive plants. So as part of the surface water assessment, or SWAS, we call ourselves, have to conduct monitoring to determine if the water quality standard is being met and if the designated uses are being protected. So I've got those 2 terms highlighted there. We use them a lot. And then what we have to do as part of the Clean Water Act is actually report on this monitoring and these designated use decisions to the US EPA, because it's a federal Clean Water Act, right? And that goes in a report that we call the integrated report, and it comes out every 2 years. It's got some technical names, 303D list. That's where waters that are impaired by a pollutant go. And then the 305B list, which is every water in the entire state. So as you can imagine, that's a pretty long list. So, and then for every single water body, we have to say whether it's meeting all or each and every of the designated uses. So here is a list of our designated uses. There's a couple of these I'm going to focus on today. One of which is I'm going to focus mainly on things that I see as stormwater issues. Total and partial body contact recreation. So that's swimming, paddling, protecting people while they're using our water during recreation. And then we have this other indigenous aquatic life and wildlife designated use, which is quite a mouthful. And it also encompasses more than, let's just say it encompasses a lot, and we'll get into that in a minute. But it's mainly to protect things other than humans. And we have a cold and warm water fishery. We have fish consumption, so people eating fish. And then we've got these 3 other designated uses that we really don't do a whole lot with right now. We assume that the first 4 designated uses that I listed will protect those bottom ones, and agriculture, navigation, and industrial water supply. So I wanted to give some examples of water quality standards and how they tie in with the designated uses. I've got 2 of them, 2 examples here, both related to stormwater. First one we're going to do is total and partial body contact recreation. That's the designated use. And we determine whether that designated use is being met primarily by looking at pathogens or E. coli. We do have one water body in Michigan that is impaired by a pH. So the water is dangerous to touch because I believe it's too caustic, if I remember correctly. But generally speaking, we use pathogens for this. And this is our E. coli water quality standard. It's meant to protect people while recreating. So it's not a drinking water standard. If we're talking about drinking water, you should have 0 E. coli, right? Because you don't want any fecal bacteria. And we use E. coli as an indicator for all fecal pathogens. So E. coli itself is, it's everywhere. It's in everyone's intestines, and they're part of the normal digestive system, but you do not want to consume it, of course. But it is an indicator for other harmful pathogens like, cholera and cryptosporidiosis and all these other terrible diseases that we do not want to get that are all fecal. So we have a partial body contact standard, which applies year round. And that is 1,000 E. coli per 100 mils. So that's the units, usually a concentration per 100 mils. You'll see people say colony forming units per 100 mils or most probable number per 100 mils. And that's really all the same. So we have a more conservative standard though, during the summer when people are swimming. That's the total body contact season, which is about to come to a close here. It's May through October. And we have 2 parts to that standard, a daily maximum of 300 and a 30-day geometric mean of 130. So how do we assess whether or not those designated uses are being met using this data? Well, we typically collect 5 weeks of data and 5 weeks of E. coli samples, and then we compare it to the water quality standard. And if more than 10% of those samples are exceeding the total body contact standard, any of those standards, then we would say that it's impaired. Or we have some impairments in Michigan that are simply due to the known presence of raw sewage. And this is actually an issue in your area because there were combined sewer overflows, still are, discharging to, Manistee Lake. So we don't need data in cases like this. If there's raw sewage, we automatically can list something as impaired. Otherwise, though, we use this 10% threshold, which is where the monitoring comes in. So now moving on to nutrients. We have a water quality standard for plant nutrients in Michigan that is narrative. It is not a specific number, which makes it a lot harder. It's a little bit up for interpretation, but there is no hard and fast number for how much phosphorus is too much phosphorus in most water bodies. We have a narrative standard, like I said, and it is quite narrative. Nutrients shall be limited to the extent necessary to prevent stimulation of growths of aquatic, rooted, attached, suspended, and floating plants, fungi, or bacteria, which may become injurious to designated uses of the state. So, as you can see, there's a lot of words there. There's no numbers there. It's open for interpretation. I mean, what is exactly a nuisance? And then we have to determine what is injurious to a designated use as well. So how do we assess that? What do we do with that water quality standard? Well, we have a number of ways that we evaluate. One of which is we do macroinvertebrate surveys, looking at the aquatic life that's in the water, living in there. They have to spend their entire lives in there, so the community tends to represent the water quality. So if the macroinvertebrates score poor using our specific procedure, which is called procedure 51, then we would list it most likely as impaired for this designated use. Or if we see nuisance algae or slimes, we would say the same. That's a nice little picture of some, I believe it's probably fungus that is growing in a stream following a milk spill. But that's a judgment call with the nuisance. Again, that's obvious. That's an obvious problem that you see right there. But when you have algae, it's kind of, well, is it a nuisance? Is it getting stuck in the propeller of a boat? And maybe it is a nuisance. And then we also have chemical pollutants that we can use for the same designated use, the other indigenous aquatic life and wildlife. So it can get really complicated. And if any one of these things, if any one of these boxes gets checked, we will say that that use is impaired. One chemical pollutant that applies to municipal stormwater that is more of an up and coming pollutant is chloride and sulfates, but specifically chloride. So that's salt, right? And we use it to de-ice our roads. So it's important to use it, but at the same time, it can be harmful to aquatic life. We just recently adopted a water quality standard for chloride. So we don't have any TMDLs yet. We do have, I believe, a few impairments in the 303D list that will require a TMDL someday for chloride. Well, that brings up part of this. The Clean Water Act requires that states have a plan to address the problems in the water body if the standards aren't being met, and it is called a TMDL. It includes a numeric goal typically. So even when you don't have a numeric standard, you still have to come up with a number for the TMDL. Phosphorus being a prime example, we have several phosphorus TMDLs, most of which are lakes. And each of those has numbers in them that had to be developed through monitoring and then modeling. But for TMDLs, one of the major parts of a TMDL is identifying the sources so that we can begin to control those sources. We divide them up to 3 ways. We have point sources, which are regulated by NPDES permits, and TMDL implementation is done through those permits. And we've got non-point sources. These are typically not regulated by NPDES permits, and the TMDL implementation is primarily done through grants and voluntary improvements. This tends to be a really big part of a TMDL. The point source is kind of the easy part in terms of determining the point sources in a watershed. Non-point sources can be huge and difficult for us to control. And then there are illegal sources. Illegal sources would be things like illicit discharges from septic systems or sanitary sewer overflows that occur in cities or places that have wastewater treatment plants. Those are illegal events. That should be 0, and that's what the TMDL will say. We like to think of TMDLs as a pie. So here's our pie. Non-point sources, I put them in this little pie as the biggest chunk because that is often true. Point sources get a slice of the pie. And then we have what's called a margin of safety, which is room for growth or room for mistakes. You'll notice that there is no slice of the pie for those illegal sources because they're illegal and we are not allowed to let them happen. Easier said than done, of course. So just some examples of point sources, which you're probably familiar with, but sewage treatment plants, biosolid land applications, regulated stormwater outfalls. So those are the ones that are in the bigger cities. Very large livestock operations, also known as CAFOs, and other similar facilities, including industrial stormwater. A lot of times we like to think of point sources as something we can point at. You hear that a lot. That's why we call them point sources. Well, that's not always true, especially as regulations have changed over the years. An example of one you can't point to is a CAFO, right? The large farms. You can point to the facility, the farm part of it, but they land apply the manure from that CAFO on fields for miles. And so you can't, there's not necessarily an outfall you can point to for that, but it's still regulated. It's still part of an NPDES permit. Same is true with municipal stormwater. our municipalities that are regulated in Michigan are working really hard to identify all of their outfalls, but some of these cities have outfalls, they don't know where they are. So, but they're still regulated. So it's important to kind of broaden your mind with point sources. Things have changed over the years. But the purpose of an NPDES permit is to limit or minimize the amount of pollution in the discharge, to protect the water quality, and to maintain the standards and the designated uses. We, EGLE, issues and enforces those permit conditions. And I already mentioned this a little bit about the CAFOs, but regulations change over time. In 2003, stormwater discharged by large municipalities came under regulation with an NPDES permitting system. Municipal separate storm sewer systems, or MS4, is what we call those. But prior to that, we considered those a non-point source. But now they are a point source, and the exact same is true with the CAFOs. They were just non-point source farms prior to being brought into the NPDES system. So now I just want to let you know that we have a mapping app that people can use to take a look at the point sources. This app pulls from our system called My Waters. So you'll see that they match pretty well if you were to zoom into your area and look at the point sources. I just wanted to show you what Lansing looks like, source mapping here. So this is the city of Lansing. You can see that there's potential MS4 regulated areas there. So those are like the crossed hatch areas that you're seeing. And Lansing has combined sewer overflows, which is part of their NPDES wastewater treatment plant permit. So you could click on that and learn about that. And all those dots you see are on there, the green ones are industrial stormwater discharge permits. And then the triangles you see there are biosolids land application sites. So what we've tried to do is all this information is in My Waters, but we've tried to pull out things that are just related to E. coli for this specific mapping system, so that we can filter out things that are pretty well unrelated to it, so that people can focus on this pollutant for this. And the little, what do you call it? The square that's yellow is a CAFO. All right, so for non-point sources, again, the biggest part of the pie, right? They don't hold NPDES permits, and we lack the authority to regulate many of them in most situations. Of course, there are situations where something is more of an illegal source than a non-point source, and then we can act on that. But other agencies may regulate them. It doesn't have to be us. So your local health department will regulate septic systems more so than EGLE would. And here's just kind of a laundry list of the non-point sources that we include in our stormwater type TMDLs. Some of these are not going to be related to urban areas or suburban areas like manure land application. Statewide is a hugely important source of E. coli and nutrients, but it depends on what is upstream of your city, whether or not that would be related to your municipal storm. So we will focus on the following ones: septic systems. We often think of them as a rural thing. There's no wastewater collection facility out where I live, so I have a septic system. But they can be an urban problem or a suburban problem too, because not all homes in suburbia are connected to a sanitary sewer system. And here's an image of just that. We have a surface failure of some sort here causing algae. That's what the green is. It looks like some kind of crazy green ooze, but that's really algae. So, but you can see how in this case, a failing septic system is contaminating the stormwater. The more common type would be invisible. It would be underground. You could have a infiltration into your storm sewer system. And that infiltration might be from a septic system, so it could be contaminated in that way. Pet waste can be a hugely important source of pollutants in all areas of the state, but locally, that can be really important. And when I say pets, I mean any kind of pets. I'm talking hobby horses, goats, sheep, chickens. This is my child chasing a chicken in my backyard. And then of course, the more obvious ones that we think of, dogs and cats. One of the issues we have is that oftentimes we put parks next to surface water, and for obvious reasons. It does in some ways helps to protect the surface water. It's not a great place to build, so it's a great place for a park, and people like being near surface water. But this particular image you see here, dog walk area, is a dog walk area that is deliberately placed right next to a creek. And we have an E. coli problem in this creek. And this next image, same location. This is actually dog poop on a storm retention pond. The people who live here, it's open. The dogs love to play here, so they just let, and when it's iced over, the dogs run out right on the retention pond and poop there. So I mean, obviously, this could be an issue, especially when it all melts. The bottom line for pets is that the poop fairy. You have to clean up after yourself. Sometimes we have to kind of force people to clean up after themselves. But just having garbage cans and the little poop bags, I see so many people using those, which is great. So if you don't provide those, people aren't going to use them. Now to nuisance wildlife, which can be, again, a really locally important issue. Obviously, it's not as big of an issue as manure land application or failing septic systems, but it can be really locally important, especially these little guys you see here. That's actually the view I have right now out in my backyard with the deer. They're eating leftover sugar beets. So that's a tidiness issue. Again, there's leftover food attracts wildlife. Raccoons can be especially important in storm sewers in urban areas, and geese love those parks. They love the beaches. So we do have some recommendations for this. It seems like it is a really tough issue because no one wants, I mean, everybody loves wildlife. I shouldn't say everybody, but vast majority of people love wildlife, and I don't want to see them harassed or hurt. But geese are prey animals, right? So they're scared of dogs. They're actually scared of swans as well, and swans are not nearly as common. So there are decoys available, dog decoys, swan decoys, that are basically scarecrows. And another thing that does work and has been shown to work is tall vegetation, because they're prey animals. They want to be able to see 360 around them and see if a dog is coming. So if you put in this tall vegetation, they're not as comfortable. So they'll look for someplace else to go. So this is Chrysler Beach over on Lake St. Clair. And they paid for this through a grant from us. Now, raccoons are a tough one. Obviously, we don't want to attract them. I don't know if you can see in this image, it's a little bit dark and hard to, I couldn't get close to this outfall, but there's a raccoon guard on this field tile to prevent raccoons from going in. And it's probably not foolproof, because if I can lift up that raccoon guard and sample in there, which we eventually ended up doing later on, a raccoon can probably work its way in there too. But one of the big things in a city with having a raccoon guard on the inlets and the outlets is the inlet with some kind of a screen over it will catch leaves and debris and trash. So if we're going to install raccoon proofing on the inlet, it requires maintenance to keep that clear. And then most importantly, no feeding of animals, and trash is the same as feeding animals. So it's basically baiting them by leaving trash out. So then there's local ordinances which can help these things. You can prohibit feeding them. And I'm not sure how common it is for people to feed raccoons on purpose, but we can also enforce ordinances to keep trash off of our streets. And I just like this picture. This is downtown Lansing. I photoshopped those little pigeons in there just to make a point. But just good housekeeping and cleanliness can make a huge difference. This is a favorite spot for pigeons. Obviously, it accumulates and can be like an inch thick, the waste there. So something that could be cleaned up. And now moving on to illegal sources. EGLE, we do our best to find and eliminate illegal sources. It's not always as simple as it seems. But here on the left, we have a stormwater discharge that is growing slimes and algae, so it's obviously not clean. And on the right, you can see a similar situation. There's this is a creek actually, and it is highly polluted by nutrients. And we started E. coli monitoring there, and we were finding like hundreds of thousands of colonies of E. coli downstream of this. It was like 250,000 E. coli. And remembering the standard is 300. So way over the standard. And it was like this regardless of the weather, wet or dry. So we pulled a sample from the storm sewer, which you can barely see there, but it's inside the culvert, and it was following the road. And that storm sewer was at 1 million E. coli. So an obvious source. And it turned out that there were 4 houses that instead of being connected to the sanitary sewer, they were connected to the storm sewer. And we reported this to our district staff, and they spoke with the township and they fixed it. They disconnected those 4 homes. And this summer we went back and monitored it again. The surface water was better. It still wasn't perfect, but they monitored that outfall while we were there. And the outfall came back at 0 E. coli, which is really what you want to see in stormwater. And it is possible. It sometimes seems like it's not possible to get clean stormwater, but you can. We've got proof. Another type of discharge that's illegal is it's not just raw sewage, it's also manure being discharged. Sometimes it's a barn wastewater or barn wash water, sorry. So you have a farm and they have floor drains, and those floor drains, instead of going to a lagoon or something of that sort for retention, they go straight to the surface water through a tile. So that obviously really difficult for us to find because we don't regulate small farms. And it's hard for us to even, get on a farm to look for issues like that. So, but with illicit discharges, it's really important that if people know about them, and you'd be surprised, people know about them, they smell them, they've heard things from their neighbors, report them. We have an anonymous reporting system at EGLE. And then with livestock issues are, again, a little bit more difficult for us, but we can tackle them, and we have. These have to go through MDARD. It's not necessarily anonymous. Actually, okay, so it's not anonymous. But if you'd like to be anonymous, the best thing to do is to talk to someone who works for EGLE, and I'll submit it on your behalf. Or perhaps your district staff would do the same for you. Because MDARD does not allow you to be anonymous. And then, of course, investing in aging infrastructure. This is a really big deal. And these are actually older news stories that were in here, but Fraser sinkhole leads to sewage discharge. This was a big one. And then in the Grand River with combined sewer overflows, it happens almost every time it rains. So, I mean, and these are things that are being worked on, but it requires a lot of money to fix infrastructure like this, particularly in these bigger towns. So I wanted to kind of wrap up by talking about our monitoring process. We take suggestions from general public or from outside agencies or from our own agency too. And we have a monitoring request form. It's like a Survey Monkey thing. It's online. It's pretty easy to find by Googling it. And I can give you the link too, or anyone can. It's kind of highlighted right there. But basically, you fill out this form, you can put in locations and request monitoring to be done by us. And we don't do them all because we can't do them all. But if they're well justified and it helps to fulfill our work as well as your priorities, then we hopefully can assist. But we'll do all sorts of things. We've got macroinvertebrate surveys, fish surveys. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. We do water chemistry, so chloride again, or nutrients. E. coli bacterial monitoring, that's me on the right, and those are my contractors on the left. We do E. coli monitoring throughout the states. Sediment chemistry, if we're looking for contaminants like toxic metals or PCBs or anything like that. We have a big sediment boat, which you see on the right. And we also do sediments in smaller water bodies, which you see on the left. Fish contaminants, to make sure that the fish are edible. We have a couple of ways of monitoring for that. We also do nuisance, aquatic, invasive species, and algae studies. So on the right, you see a harmful algal bloom. On the left, that's frog bit, which is an invasive species of concern. We also do inland lake trophic status investigations. So we will do Secchi depth. We have a sonde, which we can do dissolved oxygen, temperature, and do like lake profiles. But these are for this season, this next coming season, they are due October 30th. So you don't have a lot of time there. But the way we do things is we have each watershed has a priority year, and the Manistee watershed, I believe, is 2024. So you can put in your targeted monitoring requests well ahead of time. And if we don't do them in 2023, maybe we'll do them in 2024. So I definitely encourage you to put your ideas in there. It will ask you for a justification and what kind of questions that you'd like to answer with the monitoring. But that wraps up what I've got, and hopefully there's time for questions. This is my contact info, and we have a couple of websites down there. We have an E. coli TMDL website specifically, and then we have one that's just about E. coli. And if you were to go to michigan.gov/TMDL, there's information on other types of TMDLs. E. coli is my specialty. I probably should have said that up front, but that's what I spend most of my time on. But we do monitoring and TMDLs for other parameters as well. So yeah, so I see that there's some chat stuff going on there, but if somebody wants to read the questions to me, if there's questions in there.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, it looks like Teresa put in the link for the monitoring request form.
Thank
So
you.
that's the best way to get maybe EGLE's attention if we have some, because I know I sent you our storm drain data, and you mentioned that the E. coli readings were a little bit higher than you'd like to see. So 300, is that's the limit for surface water?
Yeah, and so that's an important distinction, is that those water quality standards, all of our water quality standards apply in surface water. So they don't apply in your storm drain, but of course your storm drain impacts the surface water. So a lot of times for our regulated stormwater, which you are not regulated stormwater as far as I'm aware, right? Yeah, so we use those as guidance, as like a guideline. So if it's above 1,000, which is that partial body standard, that might be, well, first it's too high because it could be causing an exceedance in the surface water. But we use those values to prioritize too. Like if you were going to apply for a grant or use your local agencies to do some work, you can take your stormwater data right from your outfalls and choose the highest ones as places to, and then kind of follow that upstream to use it as a guideline, as a prioritization tool. But yeah, it is important to remember that our E. coli water quality standard is for surface water.
Mm-hmm.
It's often used as a guideline to develop effluent type limits, but that's true of all of our water quality standards. That's what they're used for.
Okay.
And that's
okay. And so where can we find a comprehensive list of all of the TMDLs like in one place? Is there something specific we should Google?
Yeah. Well, if you go to michigan.gov/TMDL.
Okay.
And so if you go there, you will see a list of approved TMDLs. And then there's also a new app that we have. So we're working hard to get a lot of this in a more visual format for people so they can, zoom into their neighborhood and see what TMDLs apply in their area and where the impairments are. So we have a pretty elaborate system for the E. coli TMDLs, which I showed you a screenshot of. But for the other types of TMDLs, we have something that's called a TMDL screening tool. And you can basically do what I just described. There's a tool in there, you can click on it and it will tell you which TMDLs your area has.
Okay.
Or that apply to your area. And you can see the boundaries as well. So because it is an interactive map. So
okay, great.
The only TMDL that's, I just wanted to warn you that the only TMDL that's not on there is our statewide mercury TMDL.
Okay. And then another thing about our E. coli is it's consistently above 1,000, which is probably it's a little problematic to be that high in general. But a lot of the readings were above 2,419, and it seems like they kind of cap it there.
Yep.
Is that common that you find labs doing
Yeah.
that?
Well, with the methods that we use for E. coli, that's the upper quantification limit.
Okay.
But you can have labs run more dilutions, basically. So they'll dilute your sample further so that you can get a higher number. And as you might guess, that's going to cost you a little more.
Right.
But it can be important for prioritization. So if all your water outfalls are coming out at that upper limit, it would probably be valuable to you to pay for those extra dilutions so that you can prioritize or find out how high it really is. There's still a cap. When I showed you that storm sewer that had a million E. coli, that was the cap at the time. That was as high as we could quantify. Who knows how high it actually was?
So if we want to start if we want to differentiate the stormwater effluent that we're taking data on and surface water, how far out from the storm drain do we need to be?
That's a tough one. Are you referring to a lake as the receiving
Yes.
water? Okay, so here's something that's kind of fun, and I don't know if anybody in your group has this, but one thing you can actually look at is a thermal camera. So the stormwater is going to be a different temperature than the lake. So you may actually be able to see, we call it the mixing zone. You might actually be able to see the mixing zone. But then another thing you could do is just set up monitoring points that you regularly would monitor. So if you were to look at your storm sewer and then on the same day, monitor these surface water points. For E. coli, we usually want a minimum of 3 surface water samples in like a defined area. And that would be the end of a dock or a beach or something like that, like a recreational point. With a river, we just go across the river and do 1, 2, 3 samples there.
Okay.
But our water quality standard requires a geometric mean of 3 points for us to be able. So that doesn't mean everybody who samples E. coli has to do 3, especially in a stormwater outfall. You definitely don't need 3 in a stormwater outfall. But in surface water, that's what we need in order to make that determination is 3 samples.
Okay. And then I just have.
Well, I was just gonna say it's the only standard that is that way. So that would not apply to phosphorus or chloride or anything like that.
Right, okay. And then that phosphorus limit, is that a narrative limit for all of surface water?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
All right.
As you
And
can
then,
imagine, it would be kind of hard to apply
yeah,
we're looking for things that are unnatural. So if you're in like a cattail wetland, obviously cattails, they're supposed to be there. So they're not nuisance plants at that point. But if there's slimes or harmful algal blooms, in the cattail area, then we could make a call and say that's probably a nuisance or a health hazard to them.
so it's just kind of based on the specific conditions of the lake that you're finding?
Yeah, and we're working to make it less subjective.
Mhm.
So one of the issues is the EPA is pushing all states to get numeric criteria for phosphorus. But that has to be done we don't have the authority to make new rules.
Mhm.
That authority was removed by the legislature years ago, and it hasn't been given back. So we can't make new rules right now. So we can only
Yeah.
use and implement our existing ones. So that definitely hinders our ability to come up with a number. But that doesn't mean we can't. We have to come up with numbers anyway, right? For TMDLs, they have to have numbers in them. So we do come up with numbers. It's just, it's not enforced in the exact same way or used in the exact same way.
It's always been a little tricky to find the total phosphorus and the orthophosphate limit standard.
Yeah, there is none. That's why. There really isn't. There isn't one. So our wastewater treatment plants will have phosphorus limits.
Uh-huh.
And those are legally enforceable because it's in their NPDES permit. But yeah, for the ambient surface water, there is none. That's why you're finding none. So
Okay. And then do you have any suggestions on where we should search for qPCR testing to find out the source of?
Yeah,
Because I know Bear Lake has been really interested in that just because their levels are so high. And that's been difficult to find any information on as well.
yeah. Well, I could give you an entire other presentation on source tracking if you're interested some
Wow.
other time.
Yeah, okay.
Because we do quite a lot of it. In fact, that's one of my jobs this afternoon is to work on some of that. So it's a very complicated topic, which is why I can talk about it for hours, probably on end.
Mhm.
It's really hardcore science is really the bottom line, because we're talking about DNA, and the source tracking is actually Bacteroides. It's not E. coli. So oftentimes people want to say, I found a human marker, so therefore the E. coli is coming from humans. And you cannot make that connection. It's because E. coli is a totally separate organism than Bacteroides is. So it's not as clear cut as we want it to be. However, it can be useful. It rarely provides like a firm answer that, oh yes, this is human. You're not likely to get that answer. I think you're more likely to get that with human markers than you are with livestock or wildlife markers. But still, so what we do is we look at, we use Michigan State University, to get back to your original question. And we look at 2 human markers and then kind of look at those results in relation to the rest of the state. What do we get in the rest of the state? Because it seems like you're pretty likely to find a lot of these markers pretty much anywhere, but how much are you going to find? So, and that how much does matter with this. So, and there's a lot of reasons that you may not find a marker. This is why, again, why I could talk about it for hours. Sometimes because Bacteroides is not E. coli, I say again, and they decompose at different rates. They have different life requirements. E. coli can survive outside the body. Bacteroides cannot. So, which results in us getting a lot of negatives. So you'll sample a water body. Water body will have really high E. coli. You're like, oh, I'm finally going to find an answer. And then you detect nothing for the markers. So that's a big caveat, because it's very expensive and it may not provide an answer. So I always say the best source tracking is actually your eyes, your common sense, and a dye test if you have a septic system that you think might be failing or an illicit discharge.
Okay, and there are companies now that sell the personal qPCR machines. Do you know anything about the scientific?
Oh my goodness, I've not really heard of that. What company are you thinking of? I'm scared.
I had the first time I heard about it was at our board meeting this past Tuesday. So I haven't looked into it yet, but someone was suggesting that maybe we should purchase one of those or help the Watershed purchase one of those. And I just wondered if you had heard anything about it.
I hadn't heard about it, but at this point I wouldn't. So it's a very evolving science. I know there are companies that can give you a syringe with a filter in it. You fill the syringe and you send it back to them, but they do eDNA, which is different, right? So instead of looking for a human fecal marker, they're actually looking for human DNA. And there's a huge difference, right? Because it could be a skin cell causing that. So if you're in a lake where people swim, of course you're going to find human eDNA. And let's be honest, humans are everywhere. So you're going to find human eDNA everywhere. So I think it's something you really have to be careful with, because again, it's pretty hardcore science.
Yeah.
And an easy solution, sometimes easy is not the best, right?
Right.
So, but there are local agencies that may have a qPCR machine that can run samples for you. Some of the health departments have them. Many universities have them and are capable of running source tracking. And I don't want to say that source tracking is useless. It's not. I use it, and we use it all the time, and we spend a lot of money on it. I wouldn't do that if I thought it was useless. It's just that there's a lot to understand about it. So it's not as simple as it's not as shiny and beautiful as it seems.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Dick and Jeff?
None from me, thanks.
Okay. All All right, we're gonna go ahead and stop.
Thanks very much.
Okay, I think I stopped sharing successfully. I'm gonna
Okay.